Hey guys, Alan here, Solid Rock Bible Class. I am so glad you're with me today. Hey, the word we're looking at today is words. It's a unit of language, something that consists of several spoken sounds or some sort of written repetition. It's a way to convey a message to someone. Have you ever heard of the phrase, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me? Now, honestly, is that true? Sometimes words actually do hurt. Sometimes they hurt really bad. And then other times, they feel so good. Over 45 years ago, Margie and I, in fact, we've been married, this year will be 50 years, but about 45 years ago, Margie went to the doctor and we heard the words, "Congratulations, you're going to have a baby." Those words, they changed our lives. All of a sudden, we had to start expanding, and we had to start saving. We had to start preparing. Our lives were changed forever, and it was from just a spoken word. So, what do our words do for other people? Sometimes we have to just be straightforward with what we say, because we have to be truthful. At the same time, we've got to be tactful, right? And some people may not necessarily love the answers you give them. I recall a situation back in 2006, and I was consulting with a lawyer before I was starting the business, because my ex-boss, he had quite the reputation for suing people that left him and started their own business or started working for somebody else. And we set everything down. We had a meeting or two over the telephone, and I didn't like his answer on that one day. It was actually the last conversation we had to have, but I was going through him, talking to him about not wanting to be sued here and wanting to do things proper. And I didn't like his answer, because he said to me truthfully, he said, "At this point, you've got to resign your job." And I said, I really don't want to resign my job just yet. I'd like to hang on just for a little while. I'm not quite ready. He says, "If you want me to protect you in the future, you've got to resign your job." And I did. It didn't feel good at the time, but it was the truthful thing I needed to hear. He gave me the right answer. He gave me the right direction. But do we always speak words of life into people that are around us? Do we always take and lift them up? Are we always looking out for their best interest? Do we convey that to them in words? In 1 Peter, the second chapter, I'm going to jump around a little bit this morning. But let's look at 1 Peter, the second chapter, picking up at verse 9 here. We're going to go 9 through 12 on this. And it says, "But you're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a particular people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called us out of darkness into this marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts and war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas ye speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation." I'm sorry, I stumbled over that last verse a little bit, but let's look at just a few phrases that's in this real quick before we jump out of this. He said, we're a chosen generation. We're a peculiar people. We're people that God has set aside. That means our words matter when we talk to people. That means that, believe it or not, people listen. I remember that old commercial, and you've got to be pretty old to remember this one, but it's about the stock brokerage E.F. Hutton, and it says, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. And we need to have that type of an influence on people that are around us. And we do it with our words. And we do it with our actions, but a lot of it is what we have to say. Notice in verse number 10, he says, we have obtained mercy. Now we want to pass that mercy on to other people. And in verse 12, he talks about that our conversation needs to be honest among the Gentiles. We need to watch our words. They've got to be good words. They've got to be good words that we will glorify God in heaven. So, we've got to be careful of our tempers. We've got to be careful about the way we lash out at people. We have to say things in love. Even when they're a little bit abrasive, they've got to be said in love. You know, do we lash out? Do we say things in love? Do we speak the truth? You know, I absolutely love an old song. Hated actually leading it because of the timing on it. But wonderful words of life. Sing them over again to me. Wonderful words of life. Let me more of their beauty see. Wonderful words of life. Words of life and beauty. Teach me faith and duty. Beautiful words. Wonderful words. Wonderful words of life. Beautiful words. Wonderful words. Wonderful words of life. Are we speaking on God's part? Are we saying what Jesus would want us to say? You know, we read in Job, the 2nd chapter, verses 11 through 13, that Job's friends, they started out doing really the right thing. If you remember right, Job had terrible, terrible tragedies that came upon his life. And his friends came. And in verse 9, they started doing what was right. And then we see his friends turned against him later in the book. In fact, if we look at Job, the 2nd chapter, and we look just a little bit before that, we see his wife turned against him. It says, then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thy integrity? Curse God and die. And we see that Job took and he rebuked her in regards to what she had to say there. But notice those words, they weren't words of life that she was speaking into Job during this time of discouragement. I have one particular gentleman I absolutely love to talk to him. He's a great Christian guy. And several times we've just stopped and put our arms around each other and prayed together. One particular time he was having an extremely rough time. It was an extremely rough time many years ago now, probably in the area of probably close to 10 years ago. And I met up with this guy in a store. He stopped me. We talked for a little bit. And we talked about some of the problems. He knew some of the problems I had had going just in that particular timeline. And he said, he put his hand on my shoulder. And we sat right there in that store and we prayed. And you have no idea what that did for me. I have another extremely, extremely good friend. They used to own a business here in town. And I was in their office. And again, it was kind of during that same rough patch. And I walked in and she said, I was just thinking about you. I've been praying for you. And we actually prayed right there. Are we speaking words of life into people and into people's lives? In James, the first chapter, verse number 19, he says, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of God worketh out the righteousness of God." I'm sorry. Let's read this again. I really believe that. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. He says, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear." We need to stop and listen to people. We need to feel where people are at. Feel people's pain. And then he says, slow to speak. Guess what? We need to listen to them. Then we need to weigh our words. We need to give them words of life to go into their lives. And then really good statement he makes, slow to wrath or slow to anger. And then that verse 20, it really does wrap it up. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Don't lean to our own understanding. Rely on God. Stop, listen to his direction. In Proverbs, the 15th chapter, verse 4, it says, "A wholesome tongue is a tree of life." A wholesome tongue is a tree of life. In Proverbs, the 18th chapter, verse 21, it says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." Death and life, they're in our power. And it's that little muscle we call the tongue. If you remember back in the Old Testament, Rehoboam, son of Solomon, he inherited his father's throne, and he also took and he had a lot of problems. He took and he sought counsel from the wrong people. First of all, he went and he listened to the elders, and they gave him some really good counsel. Then he went to the younger, and they didn't give him real good counsel. In 2 Chronicles, the 10th chapter, verse 7, it says, "And they spake unto him, saying, If thou be kind to this people, and to please them, and speak good words to them." Those are words of life he's talking about. "They will be thy servants forever." But we know that he didn't do that. He was very harsh with the people. And it was a very tragic situation. And back into Proverbs, the 6th chapter, I want us to look at 4 verses here, picking up in verse 16. He says, "These 6 things that the Lord hate, yea, 7 are abomination to him." He talks about a proud look, a lying tongue. Notice he talks about the tongue. He talks about the words that we say, and hands that shed innocent blood. And then he goes on in verse 18, "A heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift to running to mischief." And then he talks in verse 19, he says, "A false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren." Notice, he said a proud look, and then he said a lying tongue. Then we jump all the way down to verse 19, and it says a false witness. And then he talks about sowing discord, talking about others in ways that we shouldn't. We need to make sure that we are speaking words of life into people. Stop people when they're talking with you. Listen to them. Give them words of encouragement. Give them direction. Give them good, godly direction. They may not always appreciate it. I have one particular individual, and this goes way back to Dave Ramsey classes. And I had talked to them at one point, and This was a person that only attended a class one time, I think. And it's also somebody I worked with. And she kind of blew me off with where I was at with my thoughts there, with taking and giving God honor and taking and, getting your debts cleaned up, because she had some massive, massive student loan debts. This last year, in fact, at Christmas time, she took and she sent me an extremely nice letter, and then she took and she called me on the phone. She's off in a different state now, living in a different state. And she talked to me about, she says, you'd be proud of what I did. I finally cleaned this mess up. We need to speak words of life into people, words that matter, words that help people. Just remember, our words matter. This is Alan. I will catch up with you a little bit later. Thank you so much for being with me today.